In the remote corners of Montana, nestled beneath the towering peaks of the Green Peak Mountains, a single road wound through vast, untouched wilderness. The silence of the surrounding forests was only interrupted by the occasional breeze rustling the leaves and the distant calls of wildlife. James Walker, a man with a deep connection to both the land and his past, maneuvered his specially outfitted van down the narrow mountain road. The early morning sunlight slanted across the landscape, casting long, soft shadows on the ground. The world seemed at peace, untouched by the chaos of modern life. Inside the van, James' service dogs, Diesel and Raven, lay quietly in the back. Diesel, a massive German shepherd, was a picture of calm alertness. His eyes were always scanning the environment, even when it appeared he was simply resting. Raven, the quieter of the two, a sleek Belgian Malinois, seemed almost ethereal, blending into the background with a grace that belied her immense strength. The two dogs were far from ordinary pets. They had been trained in some of the world's most dangerous environments, and their loyalty to James was unmatched. James, too, was far from ordinary. A veteran of several conflict zones, he had seen and survived things that would haunt most people's dreams. His wheelchair, though a constant reminder of the price he paid, did little to diminish his sense of purpose. With a prosthetic leg and a mind sharpened by years of military training, James moved through the world with a quiet confidence. Today, though, was different. There was something about the stillness in the air that hinted at change, something waiting to unfold. As the van crept along the winding road, the gas gauge began to dip dangerously close to empty. James knew the nearest gas station was still a good 30 miles away, and the wilderness around him showed no signs of a town or any kind of human habitation. It was the kind of place where you had to be prepared, where solitude was the only company you could rely on. When he spotted Cooper's Corner, the only gas station for miles, he didn't hesitate. The station was a weathered relic of the past, a small, family-owned operation that had been standing since the 1950s. It had survived decades of changing economies and the shifting tides of travel and commerce. To the outside world, it was just a stop along a long stretch of highway. But to those who lived in the area, it was a lifeline, a symbol of stability in a fast-changing world. James guided the van into the parking lot of Cooper's Corner, his eyes scanning the surroundings even as Diesel and Raven remained still in the back, their bodies tense yet composed. The station was quiet, as it often was this time of day, with only the hum of the old gas pump breaking the silence. Frank Cooper, the owner, a grizzled Vietnam War veteran, watched from behind the counter, his keen eyes never missing a detail. Frank had owned this station for over 30 years, and in that time, he had seen his fair share of unusual visitors. The remote location of the station, nestled between two mountains, made it a popular stop for those who needed fuel or a brief respite from the long roads. But today was different. Frank felt it in the air, that intangible tension that seemed to hover just beneath the surface. He noticed the way James' dogs stayed still but kept their eyes moving, the subtle twitch of their ears whenever a sound pierced the stillness. Frank had seen military dogs before. He had worked with them during his time in the service, and he knew enough to recognize that these dogs were no ordinary companions. Diesel and Raven were warriors in their own right, their calm demeanor masking the lethal precision they were capable of when the situation demanded it. James wheeled himself out of the van, his movements slow and deliberate, as though every action was calculated. The morning sun glinted off his prosthetic leg, a stark reminder of the last deployment that had changed everything. Frank watched him as he maneuvered with practiced ease, the steady rhythm of his movements suggesting a life spent in constant assessment. There was something about James that spoke of resilience, of someone who had fought battles and come out on the other side stronger, despite the cost. As James began to fuel the van, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He wasn't sure why, but his instincts had never failed him before. Maybe it was the way James' dogs seemed to be listening to something he couldn't hear, or perhaps it was the strange sense of unease that had settled over the valley. The roar of motorcycles in the distance shattered the stillness, and Frank's hand instinctively moved toward the door of the station, his fingers brushing the cold metal of the counter. James noticed the sound too, though he gave no outward sign. His years of training had taught him the value of remaining calm, of giving no indication that he had noticed something amiss. He kept his focus on the task at hand, pumping the gas into the van. But his mind was already calculating, already assessing the situation. The dogs, too, were aware. Diesel's ears had perked up, while Raven's head remained low, but her eyes flicked toward the source of the noise. The motorcycles were getting closer, and James knew that it wouldn't be long before they arrived. The Crimson Riders, a notorious motorcycle gang known for their ruthless tactics and intimidation, were rumored to be making their way through the area. James had heard whispers about them, and Frank's strained expression confirmed what James already suspected. They were close. With a final glance at his van, James slowly wheeled himself toward the door of the station, his mind running through all the possible scenarios. His dogs remained in the back of the van, but they were alert, ready to act at a moment's notice. James had trained them for situations just like this, where every second counted and every move had to be calculated. He was no stranger to danger, but he had learned over the years that the most dangerous predators were not always the ones that looked the part. The real threats often came from those who seemed harmless at first glance. The motorcycles were almost here, and James could feel the tension in the air. This was no ordinary stop. This was about to turn into something far bigger than a simple fuel stop on a remote highway. The rumble of engines grew louder as the motorcycles approached. James' eyes narrowed as the sound of the riders' revving engines filled the air. He remained calm, his hand steady on the armrests of his wheelchair, but inside, his mind was working at full speed. He knew what was coming. The Crimson Riders were infamous for their violent ways, and it was clear that today they had set their sights on him. As the bikes roared into the gas station parking lot, James felt a shift in the atmosphere. The dust kicked up by the motorcycles settled into the stillness around the station, and for a brief moment, everything seemed suspended in time. James' dogs, Diesel and Raven, remained in the back of the van, their bodies tense and alert, waiting for a command. Diesel's ears flicked, his nose twitching as he tracked the movement of the bikers, while Raven, ever the stoic, kept her eyes focused on the riders, her muscles coiled but unmoving. The first rider dismounted from his bike, a tall man whose weathered face bore the marks of a life lived on the edge. His hands, covered in tattoos, reached up to adjust the worn leather vest that bore the Crimson Rider's insignia, a blood-red skull emblazoned on the back. He looked over at James, his eyes calculating. The man's name was Kane, and he was the leader of this pack. Behind him, 4 other bikers followed suit, each wearing the same skull patch, their faces hardened and intent on one thing: intimidation. "Look what we have here," Kane sneered, his voice low and rough. "A crippled vet with a couple of fancy dogs. You're out here all alone, aren't you?" His gaze lingered on James' wheelchair, then shifted to the van, where the dogs waited silently. The others fanned out, spreading across the parking lot with a practiced ease, positioning themselves in a loose circle around James. James didn't flinch. He didn't even look at them directly. His eyes remained steady, locked on the leader, but his mind was sharp, processing every detail. He was well aware of the game they were playing. The bikers were using intimidation, positioning themselves to assert dominance. They thought he was vulnerable, a man alone in a wheelchair, easy prey for their games. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. "Is that how it works here, huh?" Kane mocked, stepping closer. "You get respect by sitting in a chair. Pretty pathetic, don't you think?" He motioned to the dogs, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Nice little pets you've got there. But I doubt they're much use in a place like this." James' lips curled slightly into a thin smile. He didn't say anything, letting the taunts slide off him like water off a duck's back. Instead, his fingers moved subtly on the wheelchair's armrest, activating the command system. Diesel and Raven, though still sitting quietly in the van, were now on high alert, their senses attuned to every movement around them. The command was simple: stay calm, stay quiet, but be ready. The bikers continued their circle, drawing closer, their posture shifting from casual to something more menacing. One of them, a burly man with a scared face, stepped up behind James, his eyes glued to the van. He was the one called Hammer, and his interest was clearly in the dogs. "Those dogs of yours, they look real trained. Bet they can bite. Wonder how they'd do if we gave them a little motivation," Hammer growled, taking a step closer to the van. James' hand tightened on the armrest of his chair, his calm demeanor never wavering. He could feel the tension building, could sense the subtle shift in the biker's movements. Diesel's ears perked up slightly, while Raven's stance remained rigid. In that moment, James knew this was no longer a game for the bikers. It was about to become something far more serious, and they had no idea just how outmatched they were. With a soft command, James spoke, his voice low but filled with authority. "Back away from the van." His words hung in the air, cutting through the tension like a knife. The bikers froze, momentarily stunned by the quiet command. For a brief second, Kane's smirk faltered, and his eyes locked with James, his expression shifting from arrogance to something darker. "What did you say?" Kane asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. James didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into the side pocket of his wheelchair, pulling out a small device and pressing a button. The dogs, ever the professionals, responded instantly. Diesel's low growl vibrated through the air, and Raven shifted ever so slightly, her muscles coiling like a spring, ready to move at the slightest provocation. James' calm voice broke the silence once again. "You're out of your depth." It wasn't a threat. It was a simple fact. He could see it in their eyes now. They had underestimated him, and they were beginning to realize their mistake. Kane hesitated, his eyes darting from James to the van, and back again. For the first time, he seemed to sense the weight of the situation. The bikers had been prepared for a confrontation, but they hadn't expected this level of discipline, this quiet confidence that radiated from James. They had assumed he was just another easy target, but now they were starting to see that James was something else entirely. "Get away from my vehicle," James repeated, his voice unwavering. Diesel's growl intensified, and Raven's eyes were locked on Hammer, her presence alone enough to make him take a hesitant step back. Kane stared at James for a long moment, sizing him up, before he finally spoke, his voice low and filled with something resembling respect. "You're not what I thought you were," he muttered, taking a step back and signaling to his gang. "All right, boys, let's back off. Looks like we got more than we bargained for here." But as the bikers began to retreat, James didn't relax. He knew that the encounter wasn't over. This was only the beginning. Something bigger was at play here, something that went beyond just the bikers at Cooper's Corner. He could feel it in the air, that same tension he had sensed when he first arrived. This wasn't just an isolated incident, it was part of something much larger. And James was about to find himself right in the middle of it. As the Crimson Riders began to withdraw, James didn't relax. The brief tension-filled standoff had given him a momentary respite, but he knew the danger was far from over. His fingers tightened around the armrest of his wheelchair as he surveyed the retreating bikers. The way they moved, carefully, with uncertainty, told him something they hadn't fully grasped yet. They had just encountered something much deeper than a simple confrontation. These weren't just ordinary bikers, they were players in something far more dangerous. But the real threat had not yet revealed itself. James turned slowly to glance at Diesel and Raven, still resting inside the van, their calm demeanor betraying nothing of the inner readiness they carried. Diesel's head tilted slightly, watching him with that knowing gaze only a highly trained service dog could have. Raven, meanwhile, remained as poised as ever, her body radiating quiet strength. The two of them were more than just companions. They were soldiers in a quiet war, each one an embodiment of years of painstaking training. They were the true power in this equation, and James knew that if things escalated further, they would be ready to act. A soft, almost imperceptible click echoed as James engaged the comm system built into his wheelchair. With a swift gesture, he activated the tactical interface he had designed himself. It was a system that allowed him to communicate silently with Diesel and Raven, triggering commands without a single word spoken. The dogs, though calm and still in appearance, were now on heightened alert, their muscles poised to spring into action. Diesel's ears twitched as his body, though unmoving, radiated the calm confidence of a predator on the hunt. Raven's sharp eyes darted toward the rearview mirror, scanning the parking lot even as she appeared to be at rest. James knew that something bigger was at play. The Crimson Riders were only the beginning. His instincts had been honed in countless dangerous situations, and he could feel the subtle shift in the air. It was as if the world had suddenly become sharper, every sound more pronounced, every movement more calculated. The bikers, who had once seemed like a tangible threat, now seemed like mere distractions in a much larger game. He couldn't yet put a name to the force that was gathering, but he knew it was out there, lurking just beyond the edges of his awareness. The sudden appearance of another vehicle jolted him from his thoughts. A sleek, black SUV slid into the parking lot, its tires crunching over the gravel with a smooth, almost predatory motion. The tinted windows obscured the faces of the occupants, but James knew better than to assume the arrival of another group would be any less hostile. These weren't people who happened to be passing through. These were professionals, the kind who didn't leave anything to chance. James' hand moved instinctively to the control on his chair, his fingers brushing the button that allowed him to communicate silently with Diesel and Raven. He didn't need to say anything. The dogs knew what to do. Diesel's nostrils flared, scenting the air, while Raven's body stiffened as if preparing for action. James kept his eyes on the approaching vehicle, his expression unreadable, but his mind working quickly, analyzing the situation. As the SUV's door opened, a figure stepped out, a tall, well-built man in a dark suit, his features sharp and deliberate. His cold, calculating eyes scanned the surroundings as if he were searching for something or someone. James could sense the familiarity in the man's demeanor. This wasn't an ordinary civilian. The way he moved, the way he took in every detail around him, marked him as someone who had spent years in the field, someone who was used to dealing with high-stakes situations. His hand rested lightly on his holster, and James couldn't help but feel a sudden, deep sense of recognition. This man wasn't here by accident. He was part of something much larger, something James hadn't fully grasped yet. "James Walker," the man said, his voice smooth, like velvet, but carrying an unmistakable edge. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. James knew that the man knew exactly who he was, just as James had already begun to piece together who this man might be. The thought sent a cold shiver down his spine. This wasn't a random encounter. This was a setup, and it was clear that the stakes were about to rise higher than anything he'd expected. James didn't flinch. He didn't even give the man the satisfaction of acknowledging the threat he posed. Instead, he wheeled his chair forward, his eyes locked onto the newcomer with quiet determination. "I don't know who you are, but I can tell you're not here to make friends," James replied, his voice steady, each word measured and deliberate. The man didn't smile. His eyes narrowed, but there was no malice in his gaze, just cold calculation. "I think we both know why I'm here," he said, his tone calm, as though speaking to a colleague rather than an adversary. "You and I are both part of a much larger operation. You've just stumbled into something you don't fully understand, James. And if you're not careful, it's going to cost you." James held the man's gaze for a long moment, his fingers subtly tightening on the controls of his wheelchair. He knew better than to trust words alone. This was a power play, one that wasn't going to end with simple intimidation. The man's presence was no accident. This was the moment when everything began to shift. The tension was palpable, hanging in the air like a storm cloud waiting to break. Frank, who had been watching from the store doorway, stepped forward, his hand hovering over the counter where a weapon was concealed. He had seen enough to know that things were escalating quickly, but even he, with all his years of experience, didn't fully understand just how dangerous this situation was. "What's going on here?" Frank called out, his voice steady, but his eyes betraying the concern that he hadn't been able to hide. He had seen more than his fair share of dangerous men over the years, but this was different. This wasn't about petty crime or intimidation. It was something much more calculated, more sinister. The man in the suit glanced briefly at Frank, then returned his gaze to James. "You don't need to worry about him," the man said, his voice carrying a tone of finality. "This isn't his fight. This is between you and me." James' mind raced, but his face remained impassive. This was just another layer of the puzzle, one more piece of a much larger scheme that had been set into motion. Whoever this man was, he was connected to the Crimson Riders, and more importantly, he was connected to something far darker than anyone could have imagined. James knew that he had just stepped into a dangerous web, and the only way out was to fight back. Without a word, the man turned and motioned for two other men to step out from the shadows of the SUV. These weren't just thugs. They were professionals, trained to handle any situation that might arise. The game had just changed, and James had no choice but to play. The calm he had maintained so far was about to be tested in ways he hadn't anticipated. Diesel and Raven, sensing the shift in the air, tensed, their muscles coiled and ready. James' finger hovered over the comm button, his mind calculating every possible outcome. This was no longer just about self-defense. It was about survival. The silence that followed the man's words hung in the air like a heavy mist, stifling and tense. James could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the way the weight of the situation had gone from manageable to dangerously unpredictable. He didn't flinch as the two men from the SUV took their positions by the vehicle, their eyes scanning the area with military precision. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to control. The thought solidified in James' mind. This wasn't about intimidation anymore. It was about power, and they had underestimated him. James' eyes flicked to Diesel and Raven, both of them waiting patiently in the van, though every muscle in their bodies was taut with readiness. He knew that the moment would come when their training would be tested to its limits. But right now, it was not about the dogs. It was about him. He needed to think, to outmaneuver these men before they could impose their will on him and everyone around him. Frank, sensing the gravity of the situation, stepped further out of the store, his hands twitching toward the counter where his weapon lay hidden. His gaze shifted nervously between James and the two men in suits, but he knew better than to act rashly. This wasn't a small-town altercation. It was something far larger, something that could potentially shatter the fragile peace that had held the valley together. Frank had lived through too many storms in his life, but this one felt different. Something about the cold confidence in the man's eyes made him uneasy. The man in the suit, who had yet to introduce himself, but whose presence was impossible to ignore, took a few steps forward. His eyes flicked to James, calculating. The air seemed to hum with tension as he spoke again. "I think we both know the stakes here, Walker. You don't realize it yet, but you've been caught in something much bigger than your little gas station pit stop." James didn't react, except for the faintest tightening of his grip on the armrests of his wheelchair. He didn't need to acknowledge the man's words to understand the weight they carried. He had seen this before. Men who thought they held all the cards, convinced that their power could bend anyone to their will. But James wasn't like the others. He had spent years in places where the rules were written in blood, and he had learned that the most dangerous people weren't always the ones wielding guns or knives. They were the ones who controlled the strings from the shadows. "I'm not interested in your games," James finally said, his voice calm and steady, betraying none of the turbulence swirling beneath the surface. "Whatever it is you think you're doing here, I suggest you walk away. You've made a mistake, and I'm not about to make it any easier for you." The man's lips curled into a thin smile. "You think you can just walk away from this, don't you? Let me explain something to you, James. This isn't about you anymore. This is about something far bigger, something that's been in the works for years. And you, my friend, have just become a part of it." The word struck James like a blow. He had suspected that his arrival at the gas station hadn't been a random coincidence, but hearing it confirmed was another thing entirely. The man was part of something dark, something that stretched far beyond the small confines of Cooper's Corner. But James didn't show any sign of surprise. His mind was already racing, calculating the next steps, piecing together the fragmented information he had gathered. "You think I'm just some pawn in your little game?" James asked, his voice low but filled with a quiet authority. "You're wrong, and you're about to find out exactly how wrong you are." The man's expression shifted ever so slightly, his eyes narrowing. But before he could respond, a series of sharp, rapid movements interrupted the tense standoff. From behind the van, Diesel and Raven surged into action, with the silent precision only military-trained dogs could achieve. Diesel, with his massive frame and unrelenting drive, lunged forward, his growl filling the air like a warning to anyone who dared to challenge him. Raven, faster and more agile, followed suit, her eyes locked on the men who had dared to threaten her handler. James, too, made his move. He wheeled forward, not with the desperation of someone cornered, but with the calculated purpose of a man who had already mapped out every possible outcome. His wheelchair was more than just a mobility device. It was an extension of his will, and as he pushed forward, he moved with the same precision and efficiency that had saved his life countless times before. The men in suits froze for a moment, caught off guard by the sudden escalation. Diesel and Raven were a formidable force, and their training had kicked in the instant they were given the command. The man who had been speaking, the leader of this group, stepped back slightly, his gaze shifting between the dogs and James. But his calm demeanor was starting to crack, his confidence faltering in the face of the unexpected threat. "You should have stayed out of this, James," the man said, his voice now tinged with frustration. "You've no idea what you're dealing with, but you'll find out soon enough." Before James could respond, a figure appeared in the distance, approaching the station with a purposeful stride. Rachel, a former military K-9 handler and one of James' old friends, had arrived. She had been tracking the situation from a distance, aware of the dangerous web that was slowly tightening around them. With her arrival, the tension in the air shifted again, but this time, it wasn't just about survival. It was about unmasking the truth. Rachel's presence was enough to cause the man in the suit to pause, his eyes narrowing with recognition. "You," he muttered, his voice suddenly cold. "I should have known." Rachel didn't acknowledge him. Her focus was on James, on the dogs, and on the unfolding situation. "James, get back," she said quietly, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to taking charge in high-stakes situations. "We've got this." Rachel's presence wasn't just a tactical advantage. It was the key to unraveling the entire scheme. As she moved forward, her eyes locked onto the man, and she spoke with a clarity that made it clear she knew exactly what was going on. "You've been hiding behind these games for too long," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "But it's over now." The man's face tightened, the facade of control cracking as Rachel's words sank in. James watched as the last bit of the man's bravado slipped away, replaced by the grim realization that his carefully constructed web was falling apart. With a subtle gesture, Rachel activated her own system, a command that sent Diesel and Raven into full action. The dogs moved with precision, their training now in overdrive. The man and his men had no idea what they had just walked into. What had started as a power play in a small-town gas station was rapidly escalating into something far more significant. The man's eyes flicked between Rachel, James, and the dogs, but there was no way out. The truth was closing in on him, and he knew it. His organization, his carefully laid plans, were crumbling before his eyes. "You've been part of something much darker than you realize," Rachel continued, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "And now we're going to expose it." The truth had come to light. The man's twisted operation, his links to a network of corruption, was no longer hidden. The tangled web he had woven, stretching across law enforcement and organized crime, was now laid bare. And at the center of it all was James, just a man and his dogs. But together, they had brought down something that had been festering in the shadows for far too long. As the authorities arrived to take control of the situation, James and Rachel exchanged a quiet look, their shared sense of victory unspoken but understood. It wasn't just about the confrontation. It was about something bigger: justice, redemption, and the power of truth. The real victory was in the unmasking of the lies, the corruption, and the darkness that had tried to suffocate their world. And in that moment, they knew they had won.